sponsor a lecture every year, the Edith House Lecture. I became a member of that group, and we were so busy studying and trying to make it through law school that frankly we didn't have much time to be activists. Although I was doing some of the things, some of these things that were going on, I've still managed to squeeze in a little bit. But I think in my class of 25 women, 3 of us got pregnant while we were in law school. And so that is what I consider our act of rebellion or our act of activism. Because the men were already having trouble getting used to women. And I remember one of my professors had seen me the spring before when I wasn't pregnant, and then he saw me that fall when I was, and his eyes just popped. He clearly was a little bit of a new experience. The other anecdotes I wanted to tell you, one was about the National Organization for Women. In the conference at which Gloria Steinem appeared at the end, she asked if anybody wanted to come up and make some announcements or say anything. And another woman and I, Mary Gibson, decided, sort of inspired by Gloria, decided right there on the spot that we wanted to start a chapter of Now. And so I went up, and the only thing I remember, my name's on that program, but the only thing I remember about that entire conference is standing next to Gloria Steinem. And we said, we're going to have a meeting next, something wrong, we made the announcement, and that was, Now was more, WOMN was concentrated on students. But I'm going to correct one thing that Linda said. I was a participant in the consciousness raising groups and was a member of WMEN, and I knew how to set up a tent. But I was probably the oldest person in WMEN. I wasn't a student yet, but I was in my late 20s. And I'm sure I was the oldest person, one of the few non-students. Anyway, back to Now. So we started, and Now was short-lived because Mary moved, and I went on to law school and couldn't keep up. But we had a Now chapter that was centered more on the people, the women living in town, of course. And one of the things that we did, Mary was much braver than I, and I was scared, but she suggested this, and we did it. At the time, the Athens BannerHerald had ads, classified ads, separate for women and men, because the women, at that time, the women's careers were basically teacher, nurse, secretary, retail clerk. And we objected to that. So about maybe 10 or few of us decided we would just go up to the Athens BannerHerald office unannounced. Were you there, Helen? Were you with us, Helen?
No, but I remember those ads.
Right, okay,
yeah, oh, wanted male.
Wanted male, wanted female, yes, we all do. And so we went up, and of course the office was little, and so we just filled the main lobby area. And we asked to speak to the editor, and the editor decided to slip out the back door. And so we really just sat. We just sat in the office for maybe an hour or so, and talked to the secretaries to see what we were doing. And so we made the point, and I don't think that they made any changes right away. But that's the one thing I remember about Now, having done in just a 2-year short history probably. But the best thing about that story is that when our younger son was in high school, I told him that story, and his response was, "Why do they need to have separate ads?" In his lifetime, and that's exactly what Jackie said the other. I repeated this the other day, and Jackie said the same thing. Why would they need? Because in his, by the mid-90s, women were in all sorts of fields, and they were no longer limited to those four fields. One other story I wanted to tell was I think the consciousness raising groups made the biggest difference to me because that's what really got me started. And Helen Wilkes and I were in the same consciousness raising group. And it gave us a sense of solidarity with other women. And it was a special solidarity. It wasn't just like your neighbor coming over having tea, because we talked about serious issues and things that really mattered to us. And when do you think that was? Fall of 71 or fall of 72?
They started in the fall of 71.
Yeah, that's when we started. And that was really my first introduction to feminism, other than reading Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique. And it's interesting, when I talk to feminist people, I ask them sometimes, how did you get involved? And the feminine mystique is very often mentioned as the scintillating moment. I read it when I was in college, and then reread it. That was in the 60s. I reread it in the 90s, and I had the same copy, with old paperback copy, and I had made notes in the margins. And when I went back and read it, my feelings were exactly the same. How was I to know that I was amazed that as a junior in college, when I didn't know I was a feminist, I had no idea I was a feminist, that here were these remarks and the things that were underlined and exclamation point that I still felt the very same thing 30 years later after having been involved in a lot of these things. My story with the League of Women Voters, and I think it was the League of Women Voters that sponsored this. Do you remember when we were interested in the legal status of women, we were studying that, and we had asked a local attorney, one of the bigger firms, to send an attorney to talk to us about the legal status of women. Does anybody remember who sponsored that? I don't know who sponsored. Maybe it was Georgia Association of, no, maybe it was Georgia Women, Georgia Women's Political Caucus. They probably sponsored it, Georgia Women's Political Caucus. And this was in this same time frame. Well, there was a pretty good, there were maybe 40 more women there. And this poor attorney, the poor guy, the partner didn't come. So he sent one of the associates, the job associates always get. And the associate came and was practicing family law, and so knew about the status of women in that area, and of course other areas too. And started talking about the fact that, number one, Georgia didn't ratify the amendment giving women the right to vote until 1970. Women at that time, we were following the old English law in which upon marriage, husband and wife became one, and the one was the husband. And out of that sprang the Georgia laws at the time, that women were not considered the natural guardian of the children. It was the husband. Paul can tell us about a lot of these things.
The man was the head of the household.
Yes. And
when the man decided to move the household, she had to go with him, or else she was subject to a divorce.
Yes. That, all these just unbelievable things. Of course, there were other things like, women could get alimony, but men couldn't.
Right.
There were all sorts of things. One of the things so he was telling us about all these things. And of course, throughout he's lucky we didn't boo, but there was immense sighs and grumblings and talking, that is just nuts, talking to each other, all this undercurrent of rebellion, and the poor guy had no idea who he was talking to. I mean, he just was talking to we could have been, he didn't know who we were, he was just assigned this task to come and talk. And suddenly he sort of, we had asked questions of him sort of in an irritated manner. We were irritated, and we weren't really irritated at him, but of course he felt the irritation either way. And so there were just lots and lots of instances. These are not things he talked about, but one of the things that this gets Heather Kleiner's goat more than anything is when a Georgia in-state woman, if she married a man who was out of state, she had to pay out-of-state tuition, even though she'd never set foot out of the state. Yeah, that God had her stuff, doesn't matter. And there was a case of a woman who was running for elective office, and she had kept her own name, and she wanted to run for office under her own name, and the persons who qualified her told her that no, she had to run using her husband's last name, which she had never used. So all those things were going on. There have been, as Linda said, some things have gone a little backwards on, but there have been some things where there have been improvements. And I think those are the stories. Those are most of the stories I wanted to tell.
I have one more that
I knew we'd jog memories.
Yeah, we do it all the time.
Yeah.
I don't know these years, some of you in here, but when you moved into Athens, and for sure if you were at the university, you were grandly encouraged to contribute to the United Way. And so we did. And then I met some of the people in the community, like Amy Nicholson, who was the executive director of the YWCO, and started learning, because you're giving to the United, started learning that where there were counterpart organizations, like when there was Boy Scouts, there was Girl Scouts, Boys Clubs, Girls Clubs, the YM, the YW. When you started looking at the budgets, you cannot, I can't remember the numbers, but the amounts of money the Boy Scouts, the Boys Club, and the YM got was just so incredibly much more money. So, we raised the issue with the United Way and everything, and it was more or less, this is how it is. You've moved to Athens, learn to live in Athens kind of thing. Well, I already told you I'm not going to go for those kind of answers. So, and again, Louise McBee was a part of this, and probably a number of you here as well. We found out that you could vote in the United Way if you were a person who donated to United Way. That gave you a right to vote. Well, but a problem was that they advertised their meetings in this like page 39 down, in this little small type. So we had to watch for that. So on the night they were going to have their vote as to who would be elected to the United Way, it was at the old public library on Prince Avenue. We just overwhelmed them with people who were not satisfied with this budget. And I remember Louise and I don't remember some others, but we got elected. And then over a short period of time, you started seeing those budgets even out, so that the Girl Scouts and the Boy Scouts were getting same amounts and so forth. But there was one man, I won't say his name, but he said, well, of course the YM would get more. He said, because those become the husbands of our women. This kind of thinking, And the fellow who, I won't say his name either, who was the president of the United Way, he was pretty stunned. He was pretty numb after that meeting. But gradually, he saw that we really meant no harm. We just wanted equity and the funding, and so those are the kind of things that you faced when you first moved here. Just this belief that these differences were acceptable, and they were not. So
I have a couple of anecdotes that are sort of similar to that. One of the things Debbie Olemi decided to do is some research about the status of women on campus, and I went to interview Mo Phelps. Anybody remember that name?
Yeah.
Who was director of admissions at this time.
Yes.
And at the time, the University of Georgia accepted in each entering class 50% women and 50% men. Well, that sounds like equity, right?
That's right.
But the fact is, women always had better GPAs, higher grade point averages out of high school, and had better scores on SATs. So it ended up discriminating against women. And so when I tried to talk to him about this, he got very upset, and he said, well, what do you want? A campus full of home ec majors? That was 1972.
I think Louise took care of that, though.
Yeah,
I
I'm
think
sure
she
she
did,
took
yeah.
care of a lot of this. Another anecdote, and Charlie Honeycutt may remember this, because Charlie and I were in student government together. One of the student senate's jobs was to allocate this tiny little budget that came from our student affairs fees. And at the time, part of that budget was to fund women's athletics on this campus. And so I don't remember the figures. You know, it was maybe like $1,500, some tiny amount of money that we were able to allocate to women's athletics. These women, these young women, were traveling all over to play sports, and they had to camp. They had, because there was no money for their travel. They had to pay for their own uniforms, or they had to buy uniforms out of this tiny scrap of money that the Student Senate was able to give them. And of course, that changed with Title IX, and there was, you know, now we have these fabulous teams and much more equity in women's sports, but that's where it was in 1971.
I have a question. What role did women of color play in the feminist movement in Athens? Because the first woman, African-American woman, was admitted to the university only in 1963, of course, Charlie and Hunter Galt. And was there a role for women of color on this campus at that time?
Well, I think when I was a student here, there were about 700 black people total on campus. And they were almost invisible. The only woman who I knew as an activist was Connie Brown, now Connie Brown Sampson, who, when Coalition 72 ran its first slate of officers for student government, David Alonzo ran for president, I ran for vice president, and Connie Brown ran for secretary. Because Coalition 72 was really committed to, you know, opening up the doors and being a coalition for all sorts of activists. But that's about it for me.
In the law school, of course, if there were only 15% women, there were just a handful of African American women. But I will say that one of the women who got pregnant was one of the African American women. So of the
one
Our
thing
activism.
that jumps out if you look at the symposia documents that are here of the three is how there were always African American issues incorporated into those symposia. It was something that was very much in the forefront of our minds, but I think at that point in history, this was before Alice Walker's womanism, and that's before bell hooks. At that point, African American women, I think, were much more identified with the civil rights movement, and there were voices of protest, because within that movement, women were often shunted to the side. I mean, you know, Fannie Lou Hamer and people like that whose names were not prominent. But, you know, those were the times.
Anybody else have questions or comments or stories you'd like to share with us? Heather.
Well, I was sorry that Gail Denby couldn't be here, so I asked her if she would tell me, if she would give me a little bit of a background of the history of how she got women in the Alma Mater. Okay? I wrote the third verse after an early, this is in the 80s, after an early Founders Day dinner at the Athens Country Club. I was attending with my PR husband and trying to behave. President Fred Davison gave his Circle the Wagons speech. I guess that means what what says here stays here, is that what that would mean? Which I and an Atlanta Constitution reporter found to be against free speech and loaded with several other positions with which I took issue. I was steaming by the end when the Alma Mater, sans my verse of course, was sung. Everyone in the banquet hall stood up except me and the Athens reporter. My husband, understandably, was appalled and kept urging me to stand. I did not. We had a spirited conversation.
Frank and candid discussion, I think.
He said, "You should have stood. It's your alma mater." I snapped back that it was not my alma mater, that it only applied to men. He said, "If I felt that way, I should just write my own." Thank you, Mary. And so, as Samuel Clemens suggested, a pen warmed up in hell, I wrote the lines that eventually became the official third verse of the alma mater. I took my verse to Louise McBee, St. McBee, then Vice President for Academic Affairs, and the only woman on President Davidson's Executive Council. She was ridiculed when she presented the verse for consideration and practically laughed out of the room. A decade passed. Dr. Charles Knapp became UGA president, and he appointed a committee to study revising the alma mater to include women. Dr. McBee shared my verse with the committee. The committee and later the Alumni Society adopted it. You notice it's alumni, not alumni, alumni. You notice that? Only one person in the alumni committee voted against it. I signed all the legal papers to give UGA absolute rights to the verse, and that's the way it was. So, if anybody knows the verse, it goes.
Please read it. Yeah, we never hear it.
This,
Read the whole thing.
the singing of the University of Georgia alma mater signals an end to each commencement exercise. And doesn't it go to da 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 da?
From the hills of Georgia's Northland?
From the hills of Georgia's Northland beams the noble brow, and the sons of Georgia rising pledge with sacred vow. Neath the pine trees' stately shadow spreads the riches rare, and thy sons, dear alma mater, will thy treasures share. And then here's Gail's. And thy daughters proudly join thee, take their rightful place, equal dreams of side by side into the future, equal dreams embrace. And then, through the ages alma mater, men will look to thee, thou fairest of the Southland, Georgia varsity. And the chorus is, alma mater, thee will honor, true and loyal be, ever crowned with praise and glory, Georgia, hail to thee. Thank you.
That's great.
I'd like to acknowledge too, we've got Pat Del Rey has joined us, who is was a professor here at UGA and founding mother, I guess you'd say, of the Institute of Women's Studies. So,
Slight correction.
Maya Blaubers
Oh,
was
yes.
the first director of the program, and she lost her position
That's right.
because of it.
she was the director of the
She
Women's
was
Studies program.
program, and she was denied tenure.
Yep.
I served on the grievance committee that when she brought the grievance about being fired. There were two women, a bunch of men. The two women voted in my favor and voted against her. We wrote a minority report. I just recently, in cleaning out my office, found the whole file on this, which I kept on. But Maya deserves better than that.
Did you say?
I think
Maya Blaubers.
Maya Blaubers.
Maya Blaubers.
Yeah, that was a big deal. I think
And she went to, after that, she attended law school.
Right.
She went to law school, and her case still was not resolved. The legal filings were not resolved 3 years later. so,
Yeah.
you know, it's still going on all through law school.
Mm. She went to law school here?
Yes.
She was a
Yes, she
Canadian, and she, in those days, if you were not an American, you couldn't get tenure. And so she was not, wasn't that?
No, that was not
No.
the issue.
No, but that was an issue that Maya had at one point.
At one point, but it wasn't involved.
But that's another thing, you know, now you can get tenure if you're,
Maya and I went to the dean.
Would you stand up, Patsy?
Hi. Maya and I went to the dean in arts and sciences at the time, Payne, and I was on the steering committee. I came here in '78. She was still here, and he said to us before we even started talking about the program, he said, "I don't believe in women's studies. Nobody would take a course with women as a title." And actually, another dean at my previous institution told me the same thing. So it was a very difficult environment. This would have been in '78, '79. And Maya was so special that she was in the College of Education. She got the College of Arts and Sciences to approve the undergraduate certificate in women's studies. So she actually established the program. What I did was just, with the fortune of having new administrators, Charles Knapp, a new dean of arts and sciences, John Kozak, and Vice President Procasi, they came from other institutions, and that was the time that women's studies had started, and we tried to convince them that it was the intellectual contribution of the women's studies program that was necessary for the University of Georgia, and fortunately, they listened. And then, of course, Louise McPhee, who was acting as Associate Vice President for Instruction, she was instrumental, as you all said, in some of the other ways about it. And we had an internal search, we submitted a budget. First, we asked for a steering committee, for a committee to be appointed to just evaluate how effective, were the courses in women's studies that were existing in departments, were they highly enrolled or not? And it turned out they were the most enrolled courses in their department. So we presented that to her. There was a $45,000 budget for a half-time director, and Louise then submitted this to Charles Knapp to approve the $45,000. So that's what happened. I remember walking outside of Louise's office, getting the news, and thinking like, oh my God, now what do you do to start a program? And I saw the library as I was walking across, and I said, that looks like a kind of high-class location. I said, we're going to try and get an office in the library. And then we did, and then we just...
And before that, Virginia Trotter had given the program money for a half-time secretary. That's all the money it had. And when Maya had to leave the university, she took that away. No money after 70, that was 79. So you got money back plus.
Well, anybody else have stories? There's
Okay.
Carol.
I just remember when we were getting our post, bachelor degree, well, anyway, we were getting advanced degrees in the Boston, Cambridge area, and I applied for a credit card at Filene's, and that was the second year we were there. We were there 2 years. I was earning our keep, and Paul was still finishing up, right? Anyway, I applied for the card, and they said it has to be in your husband's name, and I said, no, I want it in my name. So first card came, it was in his name. The second year it came, it was Mrs. Paul Kurtz, so I called and complained about that, and they just refused to put it in my name. And not till we moved to Nashville, was that right? When we were in Nashville. Oh, that's right. Before we went to Massachusetts, I did get a card from Sears Roebuck so I could go get my hosiery on the way to work. And I went through several conversations with them, and again, he was in law school, his last year of law school, and I was teaching my first year, and they did give me a card in my own name, but even it said Carol Kurtz, and that's what I wanted, just Carol Kurtz. And even with that credit history, Filene's would still not allow me a card in my name. I'll never forget that. Yeah. So it wasn't just in the South.
No, definitely.
Yeah, I
can speak for Salina, Kansas. I was in Salina during some of that early time and was involved with environmental action groups. And they patted us on the head quite a bit, but we actually had some male participation, which probably helped our status. But what we had problems because when they announced what we were doing in the newspaper, you know, I was not Penny Oldfather, I was Mrs. Mike Oldfather. The newspaper's policy was always to publish the name as in the husband's name. And so we confronted that, and they actually changed their policy. Remember, we were just so amazed to think, oh, I can be Ms. You know, it's such a small thing in a way, but it wasn't a small thing.
My first year teaching here, very first faculty meeting, didn't know a soul. And everybody had on name tags that were Mrs. John Williams. And of course, in that very meeting, I spoke up and said, no, I need to know her first name. I'm not gonna call her Mrs. Williams. I'm gonna call her Carol or whatever. So the next day we had better name tags. But it was just common sense.
Right.
I wasn't gonna call them Miss Williams. I wasn't gonna call them John.
Let me just make this announcement. The folks that left at Juanita and Cecilia, this is Women's History Month, and they left some of these flyers and talking about law school. The keynote speaker is going to be Leah Ward Sears, the former Chief Justice of the Georgia Supreme Court. So they've got all kinds of events, and she left some of these flyers behind if you'd like to know. And I'll just share one of my own oppressive, I mean, we all sort of did things that helped, that showed our oppression. I used to be a waitress at Ken's Steakhouse, paying back a state teacher scholarship back in '70. And Ken's Steakhouse, I'm sure you've seen the dressing that they now have at the grocery store. Well, they had a room that only men could go in because that's where the businessmen went to discuss important things. And I recall as a waitress, some women would inadvertently head there, and I'd say, no, you can't go in there. So, you know, we have certain things we're a little ashamed of.
Didn't you all get involved in the ERA?
I made about 40
Yes.
speeches to the Navy women, to the women of the Tuxton Methodist Church, at Augusta College, all over Georgia. I just, you know, it didn't work. As you can see, Georgia didn't ratify, but we were constantly making speeches on behalf of the Equal Rights Amendment.
And when it was first passed by Congress, it was a part of both parties' platforms that year. That's what's so strange to think about now. Both the Republicans and the Democrats made it part of their party platform. So, in just a very short period of time, between about 72, I believe, and 78 or so, the opposition organized against it and really brought it down. So.
Do you remember that Eliza Pascal came over from Atlanta to talk to us about the ERA? And she mentioned that the three objections by the opposition were, if you had a woman's rights, there would be problems with rape, recruitment, and restrooms.
Yeah.
Everybody would get raped, women would get raped because they were out there. They would be, the draft, they would be eligible for the draft. Well, look at them now. And restrooms would be.
Unisex.
Oh my God. With the transgender rights movement that's pretty active now, they raised that same restroom issue, of course, when people talk about it, so, yeah.
Well, rape is a big issue, as we said earlier, but still, it's, as you say, the over-sexualization of women is a whole issue of young women.
I don't think we should leave this, you know, it's getting close to the end, but I'll let Paul talk too, but I don't think we should leave this conversation without mentioning the Jeanette Rankin Foundation, which is one of the outgrowths of the League of Women Voters Committee that Heather and Margaret and Gail and I and Rita Rivers were on. And you know, that has been starting with $16,000, and the change that we threw into the basket at the pizzeria. Well, that's how we started. And then later we got the 16,000 from Jeanette Rankin's will. That organization, which you all know all about it, I'm sure. I don't have to tell you anything about it because we're in Athens. But now giving over we've given more than 2 million in scholarships.
2.3 million.
2.3 million in scholarships. And all that started with the very first one. You saw the picture of Barbara Dixon of $750.
Is there anyone in here who does not know about Jeanette Rankin? Because people here, some people have retired here from other parts of the country.
I may not know.
Does anybody not know?
Wow.
That's great.
That's good. Paul.
I just want to mention a point of legal history that I suspect some of you are aware of, but maybe not all of you. Title VII, which of course has been such a boon to women, actually was the beginning of Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1966, I think, 68, somewhere back there. It started as a race-based, it was about race. And of course, the Southern Democrats of that time, that was when it was the solid Democratic South as opposed to the solid Republican South. But back then, the Democrats were in power, and one of the Democratic congressmen from Virginia offered a floor amendment to this, not to oppose Title VII, but to put what he would describe, and many of you would understand in the time, what he felt would be a poison pill, and he wanted to add not just race but sex as a prohibited grounds of discrimination, confident that the Congress would never pass that. And so that's where Title VII came from. And of course, it's been very helpful to African Americans. It's also been extraordinarily helpful to women. But the point of the story is to see where this was when at least this congressman and many others like him thought, well, that's a deal killer. Surely the Congress won't vote for that. And they did. So there you go.
I don't know if it's on the women's studies brochure, but Louise McBee, if we didn't have Louise McBee on this campus and in this town, she was so instrumental. And many of you know she's in Talmadge Terrace, and she's about 92 or 93 now. And I was trying to get her surrogate daughter to bring her here, but she said it would be too much. But tomorrow she's going to be at the McBee lecture, and that will be at the chapel. I think it's 11:30, something like that. Is it on there? Anyway, it's 11, and I don't know who's speaking. Sorry to say, but she will be there, and I'm definitely going to be there and tell her what went on here. When we were trying to get her to come here, Margaret saves everything, and that brochure about one of the symposia that she was instrumental in organizing, Jane Russell took it to her, and she was so thrilled. So she remembers the pages, and she remembers her role, and she's a saint as far as I'm concerned. So if anybody wants to go tomorrow, support her, that would be great.
And also on March the 29th, Dr. Janetta Cole is going to speak at the Mary Frances Early Lecture here on campus. And Janetta Cole was the president at Spelman, and she's been an incredible supporter of the Jeanette Rankin Foundation. We've heard her before. So if you have time on the 29th of March, she is really magnificent. Now she is with African American Museum
Smithsonian.
at the Smithsonian
Of Art. African American Museum of Art.
But she's very dynamic.
Which is opening shortly. Is it just open?
No, it's the art museum that's been open for a while. Yeah. Maybe she could promote it.
Two quick things to bring this to a quick close. I think sometime also this semester Gloria Steinem is going to be here. I think, does anybody remember that? I think there's a lineup of special speakers either this semester or in fall semester that Gloria Steinem is supposed to be here.
Really?
So keep your eye out for that. Maybe I'm confused, but I think that's the case. My wife, Gail, was one of the 5 founders of the Jeanette Rankin Foundation. when I was a child, my father was in the Army, and I lived in Germany, and we had a babysitter. And when we came back, I eventually wound up here in Athens, and my wife helped found the Jeanette Rankin Foundation. The first recipient of the scholarship from the Rankin Foundation, Barbara Dixon, was my babysitter when I was 10 years old. I was in Germany.
We never knew that.
Connections go round
Where
and
do you
round.
know that?
Yeah. Connections go
Little
round
known
and round.
fact.
No, it's true.
I want to thank our panels for a really lively, interesting, informative, and fun session. We have for each of them the famous Ollie gift, which is a gift certificate for a free Ollie class for each of you. And would you join me in thanking them?
I would also like to acknowledge